How could a society that mastered the North Atlantic, crossed open oceans without engines or compasses, and survived some of the harshest winters on Earth, fail on a land that today still supports human life? Greenland was not a myth, not a brief visit, and not a footnote. For nearly 5 centuries, Norse communities lived there, raised families, built farms, and buried their dead. Then, without a final battle, without a known catastrophe, they disappeared. Not suddenly, but quietly. The paradox is unsettling. These were not fragile people, nor were they ignorant of cold, hunger, or isolation. And yet, the Greenland Vikings vanished from history while the land itself remained. Something about that contradiction tells us that the question is not why Greenland defeated them, but why their understanding of survival stopped working there. The most common explanation is that Greenland was simply too cold. That climate alone crushed the Norse settlements and made survival impossible. It feels reasonable, especially when modern images of ice sheets and polar extremes shape how we imagine the past. But archaeology complicates that conclusion. When the Vikings arrived in the late 10th century, Greenland was not entering an age of sudden deep freeze, but a comparatively mild climatic window. The pastures of the eastern and western settlements supported cattle, sheep, and goats for generations. Pollen records preserved in lake sediments, along with isotopic evidence from animal bones, show sustained grazing and hay production over centuries. Cold itself was not the decisive factor. The Norse had already proven they could build turf houses that trapped heat efficiently, share indoor space with livestock, and endure winters darker and longer than most modern people will ever face. Climate change did not strike like a wall. It advanced slowly, almost politely. And in that gradual shift, it revealed something more dangerous than cold alone, a growing rigidity in how survival itself was understood. Another widespread belief is that the Greenland Vikings starved simply because they ran out of food. Excavations reveal a far more complicated reality. In the early centuries, Norse diets were diverse and protein-rich, built around livestock, dairy products, fish, and seal. Bone assemblages show that meat and fat remained central to daily life. Yet, as conditions slowly worsened, something revealing appears in the archaeological record. Agricultural priorities remained strikingly consistent. Even as temperatures declined and pasture yields shrank, cattle continued to anchor Norse economy and identity. Cattle demanded winter fodder, constant land management, and coordinated labor, costs that rose each year. Meanwhile, marine resources were abundant, reliable, and resilient, yet remained underused when compared to Inuit subsistence patterns. This was not a failure of knowledge. The Vikings hunted seals and understood the sea, but food choices were never purely nutritional. They were cultural commitments. To abandon cattle was not simply to change diet. It meant surrendering a way of life that structured status, inheritance, and social order. Starvation, when it came, reflected not a lack of options, but a refusal to fully embrace alternatives that threatened identity itself. It is often said that the Vikings failed to adapt, while the Inuits succeeded, and at first glance the contrast seems obvious. But this framing is deeply misleading. The Norse adapted constantly, though within far narrower boundaries than we often recognize. They altered building techniques, reduced herd sizes, intensified seal hunting, and maintained long-distance trade in walrus ivory across Europe. These changes required planning, coordination, and environmental awareness. What they did not abandon was the social and symbolic framework that had served them well elsewhere. Inuit technologies such as kayaks, tailored skin clothing, and seasonal mobility were not incremental improvements. They reflected a fundamentally different relationship with land, sea, and movement. These were not tools the Norse could simply adopt without dismantling their own social structure. Adaptation is rarely a matter of technology alone. It is a matter of worldview. The Greenland Vikings adapted as farmers in a place that increasingly demanded hunters. Their failure was not technological backwardness, but cultural inertia reaching its limit. Another popular explanation points to isolation and the slow collapse of trade networks. Greenland depended heavily on long-distance exchange, particularly for iron, timber, and manufactured goods that could not be sourced locally. When European demand for walrus ivory declined and North Atlantic shipping became less reliable, the settlements grew increasingly exposed. Yet isolation alone does not explain disappearance. Archaeological layers show continued maintenance of churches, farmhouses, and social institutions long after trade diminished. People did not flee the moment ships stopped arriving. They stayed, repaired roofs, tended livestock, buried their dead, and preserved written records. This was not a society in sudden retreat. Isolation did not destroy Greenland overnight. It narrowed margins slowly. And as margins shrink, societies are forced to choose which costs are essential and which are negotiable. The Norse continued investing in symbols of continuity and identity, even as material flexibility declined, revealing a commitment to stability that quietly increased vulnerability over time. There is a darker assumption that violence or conflict brought the Greenland settlements to an abrupt end. But the ground tells a quieter story. No mass graves have been found. No villages show signs of widespread burning. There is no archaeological evidence of large-scale warfare or sudden destruction. The disappearance was not loud or chaotic. What remains instead are orderly ruins, emptied farmsteads, and abandoned churches that appear closed rather than destroyed. This silence matters. It points toward a gradual withdrawal rather than a dramatic collapse. Families may have left in small groups, returning to Iceland or integrating elsewhere across the North Atlantic world. Others likely remained until numbers thinned beyond what the land could sustain. History often remembers endings as singular events. Archaeology reminds us that many endings are processes, unfolding slowly enough to feel ordinary while they are happening, and only obvious once they are complete. Modern audiences often assume that survival depends on relentless innovation and constant expansion, that success belongs to those who push harder and adapt faster without limit. The Greenland Vikings quietly challenged that belief. They did not fail because they lacked courage, intelligence, or effort. They failed because they reached the edge of a system that no longer returned what it demanded. Farming in Greenland became a losing equation. Each winter required more stored energy than the land could reliably provide, more labor than the community could sustainably supply. Adaptation continued, but only within the logic of the existing system. Each adjustment bought time rather than transformation. Survival, in this context, was not about endurance alone. It was about recognizing when the underlying rules had shifted so far that effort itself no longer altered the outcome, only delayed it. There is a strong temptation to romanticize the Norse of Greenland as tragic heroes, undone by fate, climate, or bad luck beyond their control. But archaeology resists that narrative. These were not reckless people driven by myth or blind ambition. They were pragmatic, methodical, and deeply attentive to their surroundings. They measured land, counted livestock, organized labor, and adjusted their practices step by step as conditions changed. Their responses were careful, not impulsive. What they could not measure was the cumulative cost of maintaining a familiar identity inside a future that no longer supported it. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they slowly narrowed the range of possible outcomes. Greenland did not defeat them through force or catastrophe. It revealed over time the limits of a strategy that had worked brilliantly elsewhere, and the quiet danger of relying on past success in a fundamentally different world. The disappearance of the Greenland Vikings feels unsettling because it reflects something profoundly human. Societies rarely collapse because they refuse to see reality. More often, they collapse because they understand reality too late, after investments, traditions, and expectations have grown too heavy to abandon without losing meaning. The Norse did not misunderstand Greenland. They understood it well enough to survive there for centuries, to raise families, organize labor, and sustain community life in an unforgiving environment. What they underestimated was not the land itself, but time. They underestimated how slowly a viable world can slip into non-viability, and how difficult it is to recognize that turning point while still living inside the system that once worked. By the time change becomes undeniable, the cost of leaving has already become immense. The story of the Greenland Vikings is not a story of failure in any dramatic or moral sense. It is the story of endurance reaching its quiet limit. They lived, worked, raised children, and honored their dead in a land that demanded humility from anyone who stayed too long. They were not erased by catastrophe or conquest. History did not sweep them away. It simply stopped recording them once their way of life no longer aligned with the land beneath their feet. In that silence, there is something deeply familiar. Many families carry memories of migration, of leaving not because something broke, but because something slowly stopped making sense. Places shape us, then release us. If this story echoes a memory passed down in your own family of moving, adapting, or letting go across generations, that memory belongs to history as well. Sometimes survival is not about staying. It is about recognizing when the world you understood has quietly changed.